Now, I've done this presentation once before during a recent debate, but I did not get to finish the presentation in its entirety. So today I'm going to go through with you the effects of mass immigration and diversity in the United States of America. I'm going to start this off by talking about the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act. First of all, the American people did not get a vote on this Hart-Celler Immigration Act. I'm assuming, just based on the opinions of the majority of the population back then, that they would overwhelmingly oppose the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act if they were shown the final inevitable outcomes and how it changed the face of the country forever, changed the composition of the United States of America forever. We were promised a few things during the passage of this act by politicians like Ted Kennedy. First of all, they promised, that immigrants would not become a public charge in this country. Unfortunately, it seems like most of them are actually a public charge. If we look at the SIPP, the Standard Income Participation Poll from the Census Bureau, over half of all immigrant-headed households are on one or more welfare program. Over 70% of all Hispanic immigrant-headed households are on one or more welfare programs. So overwhelmingly, immigrants are, in fact, a public charge. So this was a lie. Another lie that was told to us by Ted Kennedy and other politicians during the passage of this act was that immigrants would not come largely from one country or area. Of course, this was also a lie if you look at the immigration and the source of immigration into each state since 1965. About 32 of the 50 states, the main source of immigration has been coming from Mexico since 1965. This is up from only 3 states in 1950s, according to Pew Research in the 1950s. We were also promised that the act would not change the ethnic makeup of the country. This was also a major lie, as white non-Hispanic Americans are set to become the minority in the country within our lifetime. Now, I'm going to go through a list of all the effects of diversity. I'm going to finish the presentation that I did not get to finish during the recent debate on the Ralph retort. Before I get into any of that, though, I just want to remind you to check out Subscribestar and Patreon. If we can get a small percentage of you over to either platform, you not only get private Patreon and Subscribestar-only content, you get access to the private Telegram chat, but we can also replace the demonetization this main channel has experienced, and I won't have to run that many sponsored ads. So make sure to check the links in the description for Subscribestar and Patreon. Your support is greatly appreciated. So let's go ahead and bust out the balance scale and make sure that you guys can see this here. This is the balance scale that I used during that presentation. We're going to start going through the effects of mass immigration and diversity in this country here. So first of all, I want to start off with the population ballooning. Now, the population has went from 250 million to 325 million within the matter of just a few decades. This is solely driven by immigration and the children that the immigrants have had in this country. This is not... the population has not increased because of our posterity. We have been below replacement birth rate since the late 1960s, so it's physically impossible for us to grow our population by this much. We're talking about 72 million people added to the population since 1965 because of the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act. Prior to this, we had the 1954 McCarran-Walter Act, which said that only 200,000 people can come here annually, and 2/3 of that migration was reserved for Northern and Western European countries because they understood that they had an easier time of assimilation. So we're going to add that to the scale there. We're also going to look at more kids in classrooms. Now, of course, this decreases the educational outcome of people when you have the classrooms full. This is something that I see as a negative. Inflation of price of housing exacerbated because of mass migration. Population increase specifically because of mass migration in the country. This is yet another negative effect of mass migration in the country. More cars on the road. This is something that if we look, for instance, at what the left always talks about when we're talking about like climate change, global warming, things like this, they always talk about CO2 emissions. Well, we've had 72 million people come over here, or 60 million people come over here since 1965, coming from a smaller carbon footprint into a larger carbon footprint. And actually, when we look at the urban areas of the country, we see CO2 emissions increase exponentially. 133% increase in Dallas, 144% increase in San Antonio, 40% increase in San Diego, 66% increase in Albuquerque, so on and so forth. In the urban areas where largely a lot of these legal immigrants are populating and residing, the carbon emissions of those urban areas have gone up exponentially. The reason being, obviously, for the most part, it's because of cars on the road. When we look at the statistics, we see that we went from 0.2 per 100,000 of cars and trucks to people to 0.8 per 100,000 of cars and trucks to people from 1950 to today. So we have extra cars on the road as well. And I'm sure those of you who commute to work every day quite a while probably can understand why this is, many reasons why this is a bad thing. 16,000 extra gangs. 16,000 extra gangs, according to the National Gang Center. Almost 50% of all gang members in this country are Hispanic, and obviously these extra gangs would not be here if it were not for the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act, when we went from only 3% of our population being Hispanic back in 1950 to today, where we have about 18 to 20% of our population being Hispanic today. Those 16,000 extra gangs would not be here. Thousands of extra poor, high-crime areas. So these underserved neighborhoods, as Michael Bloomberg would like to call them, these underserved neighborhoods would not exist. We have thousands of extra high-crime, poor areas, largely Hispanic, in the country today that would not exist. They absolutely would not exist if not for the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act. Now, we can look at hundreds of neighborhoods, not just one, not just two, but hundreds of neighborhoods that have undergone this demographic transformation. And we look at the crime rates now of those particular areas. We look at how they look, and of course, they're worse off. So it's for the worse. So we look at, for instance, Anaheim. This is a neighborhood that I brought up, just one of hundreds of neighborhoods that I can go to talk about the final transformation of these particular areas. And Anaheim was one of the safest cities in California that used to be the Golden State. Today, Anaheim is extremely dangerous. When I lived in Anaheim, I heard gunshots outside of my window frequently. You couldn't park on the streets in a lot of areas in Anaheim because of the drug dealings that were happening. And of course, the gang membership, as we said, is high in Anaheim. We also look at other neighborhoods as well, not just one, not just two, like I said, but hundreds of neighborhoods that underwent this transformation as well. Higher violent crime. We look at robbery, rape, and aggravated assault, and those particular violent crimes are higher per capita today than they were in 1950. 3 times higher, as a matter of fact, than they were today in 1950. We also have national IQs going down. Assimilation has gone to basically zero. If we look at some of the things that George J. Borjas talks about, that Paul Collier, another economist, talks about, that Edward Lazier, another economist, talks about, and we look at the enclaves that have been formed in this country, majorly Hispanic enclaves, and it seems like the necessity for assimilation, such as speaking English, things like this, has gone down. I mean, effectively reached zero if you're listening to George J. Borjas, or very small if you're reading some of Paul Collier's work or Edward Lazier's studies, Robert Putnam, things like this. So the assimilation has gone down because of the sheer amount of people flowing into the country, creating these enclaves where they don't need to speak English. They don't need to speak English. They don't need to assimilate into society. No dominant culture soon within our lifetime to assimilate to. This is another thing that I view as negative. I view as on the negative side, where eventually within our lifetime, probably 30 years from now, there will be no dominant group of people, no dominant culture to assimilate to. Once again, I view this as a negative. Increase in homelessness. This is also a negative of mass migration into this country. Since 1965, we've had mostly low-skilled, low-wage workers who don't have a high school education flowing into this country. And those jobs, those low-skilled jobs, and I hate to say low-skilled jobs, because if you've tried to do any sort of remodeling on your own house, it's extremely difficult, and it takes hours and hours of watching videos on YouTube to figure out how, for instance, to waterproof your shower, with the liner and the waterproof and the cement board and things like this. This is something that I'm experiencing today. So I hate to say low skilled, but blue collar America. This is who is overwhelmingly affected. And we look at the jobs that the low-skilled immigrants are taking, and a lot of those jobs are going to be automated out of the market, which, if you look at projections, we're talking about anywhere between 15 to 30 million jobs which are going to be automated out of the market, and largely those are low-skilled jobs, which means homelessness will inevitably increase. We look at the constant downward pressure on wages of blue-collar Americans. If you, for instance, look at the study on the Mariel boat lift that George de Borjas performed, if you look at just the sheer supply of labor in this country, it's obvious that corporations are not really having to compete for the worker any longer, and the workers having to compete for the corporations. Now, because of Trump administration policies, admittedly, we see low-skilled natives, blue-collar America, their wages are beginning to rise finally. Now, when we talk about real wages, when you include inflation, it's a different story. And the real wages of said Americans should be much higher than they are today because of wage stagnation, because of the sheer supply of labor that we have had flow into this country. They're not as high as they actually should be. When we look at the wages going up and we look at the immigration, the effects of the Trump administration and immigration policy, we do see studies that show that corporations are actually having to finally offer benefits packages, free college, possibly free education, free on-the-job training. They're having to poach, even when we look at certain stories where companies have to go to other companies and offer a higher wage. These are things that happen, and this is just, and I'll quote CIS, the Center for Immigration Studies, and the Migration Policy Institute, for wages to rise, immigration must fall. Obviously, we all understand the supply and demand economics side of things. Billions of dollars on education for illegal and legal immigrants. Billions of dollars. So the estimate is about $60 billion to educate illegal immigrants in our society today. This does not include the legal immigrants in our public education system. This is almost 10% of the total federal annual budget for education in our country for K through 12 schools, which is about $700 billion. Lower academic achievement. If you go to greatschools.org, this is a website that shows you the test scores for English, for math, for science, for all of the public schools in the country via a ratings system. And if we look, it doesn't matter if we look in a poor district or a rich district or a middle-class district, the rankings are always the same. You have Asians at the top of even English scores, math scores, science scores. White Americans, non-Hispanic, are second. Hispanics are third. Black Americans are last. So this inevitably, with the demographic shift that's happening in this country, this will inevitably produce a lower academic achievement. And we actually see this happening. Billions for resettled refugees. So we're talking about billions of dollars in taxpayer funds to resettle refugees in this country. Now, we have problems of our own, obviously. When we look at wage stagnation, we look at homelessness increasing, we look at drug overdose, we look at deaths of despair, 70,000 people dying from drug overdose, the opioid epidemic, all these different problems that we're experiencing here at home. Obviously, we don't have enough money to start supporting people who are coming in here, extra people who are coming in here. IQ in the military branches are declining pretty drastically, and you can see this pretty much across all branches of the military. Now, I view this as negative, and I think that probably a lot of you would probably view this as a negative as well. UK, for instance, if we look outside of the U.S. and we look to the UK, we see that stories that investigations into grooming gangs, 80% of whom are largely of Middle Eastern descent, South Asian descent, Pakistani largely, we see the investigations were covered up. Lots of the investigations were covered up. This was revealed by whistleblower detectives in the UK who said that the police were told to, quote, investigate other ethnicities. This is, of course, a problem that is spawned from increase in diversity in the West. Diversity, mass immigration into this country, is not good for democracy. If we look to Daniel Ziblatt, who is a political scientist, and other political scientists, they have argued that a conservative party is key to democracy. It's key to democracy, and that conservative party the Conservative Party in the United States of America isn't going to have a chance to win any national elections ever again because of mass immigration, because of mass diversity increase, because of the diversification of this country. This is something that even the Washington Post admits and boasts about. This is something that the New York Times admits and boasts about. For instance, in Virginia, Donald Trump lost the state by 5 points in 2016, but won the white vote by 25 points. The Washington Post and the New York Times boasted about the win for Democrats in the state of Virginia and says that it's because of the white population going down in the state of Virginia, because of mass legal immigration, because of demographic change in the state of Virginia. This is also happening in Texas. For instance, if we look in the top 5 counties that make up 36% of all Texans, Beto O'Rourke won about 80% of the Latino vote over Ted Cruz. Texas is going to be a supermajority Hispanic by 2024 or so. So the prediction is, my prediction at least, is 2028 Texas will go blue. Arizona is going blue. They elected their first Democrat senator for the first time in a quarter century. These things are all going to lead to the Conservative Party in the country that political scientists say are key to democracy, never being able to win a national presidential election again. And actually, we're Senate, House of Representatives races, district races, things like this. This is all going to go away, and we see this in the trend. The Second Amendment. Now, I'm not sure how a lot of you feel about the Second Amendment, but I like to protect the Second Amendment. It is the Second Amendment in the Constitution of the United States of America. When we look at the statistics, we see that 70% of Hispanics and 70% of Black Americans say that it's more important to control gun ownership than to protect gun rights. This is obviously an issue. This is the reason why the Washington Post once printed an article that said that the NRA will fall. Just look at the demographic shift. It's because the white Americans are largely the ones who support gun rights in this country and have done so for the longest time. As far as voting goes, we can look at the trend of Hispanic voting in this country, dating all the way back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and we can see them never going over 35% for the Republican Party. They've always been along the lines of about 70% for the Democrats, and this doesn't really change. Not even in the second or third generation, it's still overwhelmingly, even the fourth generation, it's still overwhelmingly for the Democrat. Low civic engagement and lower trust in the most diverse neighborhood states and eventually the country. This comes from the largest study ever done on civic engagement by Robert Putnam. It was called E Pluribus Unum. And at least the data in his study says, if we look to the New York Times, for instance, the most diverse settings tend to be the lowest trust settings, tend to have the lowest civic engagement, i.e., more people slipping through the cracks of society. Prison reform is another one. This is a big one. Releasing violent criminals early because people think that blacks and Hispanics are just getting locked up because they're Black and Hispanic. Obviously, this is not true. When we look at the crime rates of certain ethnic groups in this country, we can see that they're far higher for Black Americans and Hispanic Americans in this country than they are for Asian Americans and white Americans. Recently, because of the prison reform bill that Jared Kushner championed, there was a murderer released early, and he went on to murder people. Tom Cotton and other senators tried to institute an amendment into the First Step Act, and they failed, unfortunately. But the amendment would have said that women who were raped would be alerted if their attacker was released early. Of course, the Democrats said that women don't want to know that their attacker is released early, and Tom Cotton was one of the ones who is pushing for that amendment, of course, to no avail. Gangs databases are being dissolved because they contain too many, quote, people of color. If we looked at Cook County, for instance, there was only a 5% error ratio, I believe, in the gangs databases in Cook County and Chicago. And Alma Anaya and some activists got Cook County to dissolve the gangs database. This is something that also occurred in the UK when we look at Sadiq Khan, who said that we have to get rid of the Met Police gangs database because it contains too many people of color. Well, the answer for this is because if we look at the age-adjusted homicide rate, for instance, at least here in America, we can see that Black Americans commit a homicide rate of 20 to 30 per 100,000, whereas white Americans commit a homicide rate of 2 per 100,000. Asians are even much lower than this. If we look at the UK, Britain, and Wales, we can see that the arrest rate for crimes for blacks in Britain are also higher, much higher than white British. So this is the reason for the gangs database containing a larger portion of people of color, but of course people don't want to admit this. Obesity rates. This is something that is increasing across ethnic lines, but if we actually look to the CDC and we look at obesity rates across ethnic lines, we see that it's around 50% for Hispanics, 50% for Black Americans, and around 30 to 35% for white Americans or so. So we look at the obesity rates, of course, increasing with the demographic change that's occurring in this country at a far faster rate than it would have if we, like, pre-1965 levels. And, of course, this has a lot to do with culture, admittedly, but this is something that I see as, of course, a negative. Now, we can go to all the ethnic conflict, and I'll just make this one. I don't have to put in the weights for each and every one of these points, but if we just look at what ethnic conflict looks in this country, for instance, right now, we see it appearing as ending gifted programs. In New York City, they were talking about ending gifted programs in New York City to, quote, desegregate schools because, according to the New York Times, it's largely whites and Asians who are in these gifted programs on average. Ending entrance exams for elite high schools in New York City. This is also something that is being done to, quote, desegregate schools. We look at Common Core. One of the people that helped write Common Core said he did it to end, quote, white privilege. These were all forms of ethnic conflict, in my opinion. Ending the SAT requirement for universities. There is a NGO called the Public Council who sued California universities for the SAT requirement, saying that it violates the Civil Rights Act. So ending SAT requirement for universities. Now, I don't know about you, but this is probably a bad thing. This is probably going to be a negative thing. Ending gifted programs, encouraging academic scholarship, encouraging academic achievement. This all ends with diversity. Doctors, scientists, and engineers being selected specifically because of the color of their skin. We saw recently, of course, a tweet from CNN that was complaining. They were complaining about the coronavirus task force that Trump had assembled and the lack of diversity within this coronavirus task force. Now, we're seeing this in medical schools where kids are having to pretend that they're black in order to get to medical schools. Kids being pushed aside, even with higher test scores, for the more diverse student. In Michigan, for instance, there was one student who couldn't even do basic math, and she admitted this openly. She was the valedictorian of her high school class in Detroit, in a school that's ranked 2 on gradeschools.org. She got into a pretty prestigious university in Michigan, and she admitted openly that she couldn't even do basic math. But were they mad? Was this university upset about this? No, they actually celebrated it. They said that we are celebrating the most diverse class ever, the most diverse student body ever, with a 24% increase in African Americans, and this is something that is actually celebrated. I, on the other hand, view this as a negative. We look at diversity departments in corporations and schools and things like this. Monuments coming down, so we're looking at Confederate monuments, for instance, our history being taken down, whether you like that history or not. It's never a good idea to start getting rid of history. Now, this was just the start of it, because the Confederate monuments are all coming down. This led to statues of Christopher Columbus being taken down all across America. This then led to statues of William McKinley being taken down in certain cities in America. Then murals of presidents being covered up, like George Washington, because he was some racist slaveholder. These are all things that are forms of ethnic conflict, stemmed and birthed and spawned by increasing diversity in this country. We have universities who have reported that they're going to be ceasing teaching philosophy because it's dominated by white males. Other universities that are saying that they're having no white safe spaces. Yale University, one of the most prestigious university, who says that who had a POC only ski day at one point in time. This is one of the most prestigious universities in the country. We also have Yale, the same school, who ended an art history course because it's too white. We have further self-segregation and conflict. This is another thing that I view as a negative, where you look at the racial dot map of the country and the melting pot theory. is mostly BS. When we look at the racial dot map, we can see that everyone self-segregates. So we're not just talking about how white people feel, how black people feel, how white people feel about Hispanics, so on and so forth. We're talking about everyone. We're talking about everyone. And when we look at Hispanics and blacks, they also self-segregate. When we look at Asians, they self-segregate as well. Whites self-segregate. And when we look at the black neighborhoods that have been completely taken over, that, you know, were populated by black Americans for 200-300 years, largely. These neighborhoods are also being taken over by Hispanics as the population increases the population of Hispanics increases in this country, and the demographic shift continues. This is also creating ethnic conflict between Hispanics and blacks. So not just whites, not just, you know, the whites and blacks or whites and Hispanics, whatever, what have you. The flight exists among all ethnic categories in this country. Self-segregation exists amongst all ethnic categories in this country. Hispanics decide to segregate from blacks, and Hispanics decide to segregate from Asians, and Asians from Hispanics, and Asians from blacks. And when we look at the ethnic conflict that occurs within those particular groups, not just white Americans, outside of white Americans, we can see, for instance, Hispanic gang members firebombing African-American households in order to get them out of the neighborhood, taking over entire neighborhoods. This exists across racial lines. We look at the sheer number of construction workers, for instance, that are Hispanic. This used to be a very high-paying job for blue-collar Americans, manufacturing, things like this, service industry. We look at over 50% of the construction workers in Texas who are illegally here. About 60 to 70% of all construction workers across the United States of America are Hispanic. And these are jobs that were higher paying jobs, but they have been flooded by labor. And this is something that even the LA Times, by low skilled labor because of the immigration policies. And this is something that's even admitted by the LA Times, talking about wages decreasing in the area of construction. This is from the LA Times. In the span of a few decades, Los Angeles area construction went from an industry that was 2/3 white and largely unionized to one that is overwhelmingly Latino, mostly non-union, and heavily reliant on immigrants, according to the Los Angeles Times review of the federal data. At the same time, the jobs got less lucrative. American construction workers today make $5 an hour less than they did in the early 1970s, of course, adjusted for inflation. Most jobs, I mean, you can afford to support a family of 5 and work at a gas station because wages were higher in the 50s and 60s than they were today. This is obviously in large part because of the flood of the labor pool that has occurred in a lot of different job areas of the country. The share of immigrants in construction in California jumped from 13% in 1980 to about 43% today, according to the CLA analysis of federal data. So when we look at all these things, we see that these are all negatives. These are all negatives, and the negatives far outweigh any positives. Now, I mean, I don't know about you, but the positives that I keep hearing from people is this.
But what have we got from diversity? What are these great things that I'm talking about that we've got from diversity? Well, you have food, you have music, you have all these great cultural things. And also food. White people food is fucking boring, dog. White people food is not good. If you want to have good food, you go and get some Asian food or Mexican food or some African food. African food is good, y'all. That shit's good as hell. Sambusa, good as hell.
So yes, all of these negatives that you see here on this side are totally worth the kebabs and the burritos and the tacos and, hey, maybe even coming to a town near you, maybe the bat soup. The bat soup coming to a town near you is one of the things that is, of course, totally worth all the negatives on this side. So these are the things that... This is basically what I wanted to go over with you today, the effects of diversity. I'm going to try to take this off without spilling this here. But the effects of diversity, the effects of mass immigration on the country. Now, obviously, the negatives far outweigh the positives, and this is the presentation that I did not get to finish during the debate on the Ralph retort. Make sure to check out the links in the description below for Subscribestar and Patreon. And, of course, my patrons apply. PrepareWithVincent.com. And let's go ahead and end this as we always do. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live. This is Romans 8:13. Videos are posted almost every day on this channel, so make sure to hit the bell so that you're notified when I post a new video. Also, check out the links in the description for Subscribestar and Patreon if you want to get your name in the credits or access private content. Also, check out the alternative text sites that I'm on, like Gab and Telegram, where I can talk about stuff that I can't talk about here and they won't ban me. Make sure to share this video with family and friends.